July 23rd, 1972. Reykjavik, Iceland. The Cold War is raging, and the entire world is watching two men battle over a chessboard. On one side sits Boris Spassky, the Soviet world champion, representing the mighty USSR chess machine. A man so confident in his preparation that when his team asked, "What if Bobby doesn't play e4?" Spassky laughed it off. "I'll just play the Tartakower," he said. "I've never lost with it. What can Fischer possibly do?" On the other side, Bobby Fischer, the American challenger, who's about to prove Spassky catastrophically wrong. This is Game 6. The match is tied. And in the next 41 moves, Fischer is going to do something so brilliant, so devastating, that the world champion himself will stand up and applaud his own defeat. This is the Applause, the game that turned the Cold War on its head. Let's dive in. Fischer opens with pawn to c4, and the crowd goes silent. This is shocking. Fischer has played pawn to e4 his entire life. Everyone expected it. But here, in Game 6 of the World Championship, Bobby plays the English opening. Spassky responds with pawn to e6, preparing for what he thinks will be a queen's gambit. Fischer develops his knight to f3, staying flexible and keeping Spassky guessing. Spassky pushes pawn to d5, trying to steer the game into familiar territory. The queen's gambit declined, his comfort zone. Bobby pushes pawn to d4, and now we've transposed into the queen's gambit. This is the first time in Fischer's career he's ever played this opening with white. Spassky develops his knight to f6, thinking he knows this position inside and out. Fischer brings his knight to c3, continuing standard development. Spassky develops his bishop to e7, following his beloved Tartakower defense, a line he's never lost with. White develops bishop to g5, pinning black's knight and putting pressure on the position. Spassky castles kingside, getting his king to safety and preparing for the middle game. Fischer plays pawn to e3, solidifying his center and preparing to develop his kingside pieces. Spassky pushes pawn to h6, kicking the bishop and preventing any future pins. White retreats his bishop to h4, maintaining the pin on the knight. Spassky plays pawn to b6. This is the Tartakower variation, the system Spassky trusted completely. But Fischer has prepared something devastating. Fischer captures with c-pawn, takes d5, opening the position. Spassky recaptures with knight takes d5, maintaining material balance. White captures with bishop, takes e7, trading off black's dark-squared bishop. Spassky recaptures with queen, takes e7, keeping his position solid. Fischer captures with knight, takes d5, simplifying the position. Spassky recaptures with e-pawn, takes d5, maintaining his central pawn presence. White plays rook to c1, activating the rook on the open c-file and preparing to pressure black's queenside. Spassky develops his bishop to e6, activating his light-squared bishop and defending his position. Fischer brings his queen to a4, creating immediate threats against black's queenside and eyeing the c6 square. Spassky pushes pawn to c5, trying to gain space and challenge white's center. White moves queen to a3, pinning the c5 pawn and creating uncomfortable pressure. The pawn can't advance to c4 because the queen on e7 would be undefended. Spassky plays rook to c8, defending the c5 pawn and activating his rook. Fischer plays bishop to b5. This is the key move. This was played in a 1970 Soviet championship game between Furman and Geller. Geller showed Spassky the correct defense after that game, but Spassky has forgotten it. Black plays pawn to a6, attacking the bishop, but this is already a mistake. Geller had shown Spassky that queen to b7 was the correct move. White captures with d-pawn, takes c5, winning the pawn battle in the center. Spassky recaptures with b-pawn, takes c5, trying to maintain some pawn presence. Fischer castles kingside, bringing his king to safety and connecting his rooks. Spassky plays rook to a7, defending the a6 pawn and preparing to potentially double rooks. But this is the same mistake Geller made in 1970. Spassky has walked into Fischer's preparation. White retreats bishop to e2, repositioning it while keeping pressure on black's position. Spassky develops his knight to d7, finally getting his last piece into the game, but his position is already becoming difficult. Fischer jumps knight to d4, centralizing it powerfully and attacking the bishop on e6. Spassky moves queen to f8, repositioning the queen and preparing to defend. White captures with knight takes e6, winning the bishop pair and damaging black's pawn structure. Spassky recaptures with f-pawn, takes e6, but now his kingside is permanently weakened. Fischer strikes with pawn to e4. This is the key breakthrough, attacking black's center and gaining space. Spassky pushes pawn to d4, trying to create a passed pawn and generate counterplay. White advances pawn to f4, gaining more space and preparing to launch a kingside attack. Spassky plays queen to e7, centralizing the queen and trying to coordinate his pieces. Fischer pushes pawn to e5, gaining even more space and restricting black's pieces. The noose is tightening. Spassky plays rook to b8, trying to create activity on the b-file and find counterplay. White develops bishop to c4, eyeing the weak e6 pawn and preparing to invade. Spassky moves king to h8, getting off the dangerous diagonal and preparing to defend. Fischer brings queen to h3, targeting the e6 pawn and creating threats. The pressure is mounting. Spassky plays knight to f8, bringing the knight back to defend the kingside. White plays pawn to b3, solidifying the queenside and preventing any counterplay. Spassky pushes pawn to a5, trying to create some activity on the queenside. Fischer advances pawn to f5, breaking through on the kingside. This opens lines toward black's king. Spassky captures with e-pawn takes f5, forced to accept the challenge. White captures with rook takes f5, activating the rook and creating immediate threats. Spassky moves knight to h7, trying to reposition it and defend the kingside. Fischer brings rook from c1 to f1, doubling rooks on the f-file and creating overwhelming pressure. Spassky plays queen to d8, repositioning the queen and trying to defend the back rank. White moves queen to g3, preparing mating threats and maintaining maximum pressure. Spassky plays rook to e7, activating the rook and trying to defend. Fischer pushes pawn to h4, preventing any knight jumps to g5 and gaining space. Spassky plays rook from b8 to b7, doubling rooks on the 7th rank for defense. White advances the devastating pawn to e6. This passed pawn is becoming unstoppable. Spassky plays rook from b7 to c7, trying to defend against the threats. Fischer centralizes queen to e5, dominating the board from the center. Spassky plays queen to e8, trying to defend but running out of moves. White pushes pawn to a4, restricting black's pieces even further. Spassky plays queen to d8, repositioning but still struggling to find a plan. Fischer plays rook from f1 to f2, preparing to infiltrate further. Spassky plays queen to e8, trying to hold the position together. White repositions rook to f3, preparing the final breakthrough. Spassky plays queen to d8, repeating moves but with no real plan. Fischer plays bishop to d3, improving the bishop and preparing for the final assault. Spassky plays queen to e8, still defending desperately. White centralizes queen to e4, creating multiple threats. Spassky plays knight to f6, trying to block some lines but walking into tactics. Fischer unleashes. Rook takes f6, sacrificing the exchange to destroy black's kingside. Spassky recaptures with g-pawn, takes f6, forced to take. White continues with rook takes f6, dominating the 6th rank and creating unstoppable threats. Spassky plays king to g8, trying to escape, but there's nowhere to run. Fischer plays bishop to c4, aligning the bishop on the deadly diagonal and preparing the final blow. Spassky plays king to h8, but it's too late. Fischer delivers the knockout blow with queen to f4. The threat of rook to f8 is unstoppable. Black's queen will be lost and checkmate will follow. There is no defense. Spassky stares at the board. He sees it. Rook to f8 is coming, and there's absolutely nothing he can do. The world champion resigns. And then, something extraordinary happens. Boris Spassky stands up from his chair and begins to applaud. The audience joins in, and the entire playing hall erupts in applause for Bobby Fischer's masterpiece. Fischer, stunned by this gesture from his opponent, later said this moment touched him deeply. He called Spassky a true sportsman. Bobby Fischer has just taken the lead in the World Championship match for the first time. The tide has turned. The American has shocked the Soviet chess machine, and the chess world will never be the same.